Well, welcome. Very warm welcome to Quine from Nottingham, teaching associate at Nottingham. Did a PhD at Nottingham. Our good friend Carly Crouch. Prior to that, did undergrad at Nottingham and MA at Oxford with John Barton.
Yes.
So, very warm welcome. We're interested to hear the paper and listen to the paper. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for having me. As advertised, I did my PhD at Nottingham, finished last year. And this is taken from the PhD. It is about 10 pages in the introduction of the PhD. I'm afraid I could not fit the whole thing in. So what I am presenting on today is the host of heaven, which have been the bane of my life for 3 years. I've spent 2 years of the PhD trying to work out what they were, and the final year trying to work out what to do instead. As you will see, there are problems. So, the host of heaven in the Hebrew Bible. And am I right in thinking I'm speaking for like 40, 45 minutes? Yeah. Great. Okay. The host of heaven, Sabah HaShemayim in the Hebrew. Oh, and I should actually say before I start, you will see that there are 4 sections on the outline. Most of this paper will be section 1, so do not panic if we are half an hour in and just still on section 1, okay? Just to warn you. But, the host of heaven. If you look up the host of heaven in a dictionary entry, or indeed if you think about what you might have heard about the host of heaven, you will probably hear these 4 things. That they were Yahweh's divine army, that they were the stars, that they were the divine council, and if you know your Psalms, that they could be a divine congregation, worshipping Yahweh in the heavens. So you'll get 4 main depictions or main interpretations of them. I would add a 5th, the undefined host, which is actually the majority of the references in the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to go through these in turn and do my best to say what we can or indeed cannot say about them. So the host of heaven as a divine army. This is the most popular interpretation, and I mean that quite literally, and it's the most widespread, and it is the most popular interpretation outside of biblical studies. It will be the first one that comes up in a dictionary entry, and I have serious problems with it. The first examples on your handout will invariably be the first 2 references that come up in any exploration of the host of heaven. And these are non-host references, but they are cited as though they are evidence of the host of heaven. So Judges 5:20 says, "The stars fought from heaven, from their courses they fought against Sisera." This is widely believed to be a reference to the host of heaven, because, as we will see, the host of heaven can also be depicted as the stars. So therefore you've got stars fighting, therefore it must be the host of heaven. That's the logic. However, neither Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, nor the entire book of Judges ever mentions the host of heaven. It never mentions Sabah HaShemayim. It never uses the divine title for Yahweh, Adonai Tzebaot. It's the host language of Tzavah is not there. With Judges 5, we also want to think about date. Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, is widely, not exclusively, but widely thought to be one of the earliest texts in the Hebrew Bible. The vast majority of references to the host of heaven come up at the earliest in late 7th century texts, and most of them probably exilic or post-exilic. So we've got a big gap here. Using a very early reference to just the stars to define a much later textual phenomenon is questionable, I would say. So I have a problem with Judges 5:20, which is the main one people look at. Then you will also see Joshua 10 in there. Joshua 10, I've actually missed off the moon somehow, because the moon's in verse 12. But Joshua 10 has the battle of the Israelites fighting the Gibeonites, and the sun and moon stop in the sky. which has led to lots and lots of interesting discussions of whether that's an eclipse or quite what's going on. But it says, there's been no day like it when Yahweh heeded a human voice, for Yahweh fought for Israel. No mention, again, of the host of heaven, but some people think this is an example of the host of heaven, that the sun and moon are part of the host of heaven, and when they stopped in the sky, therefore Yahweh was commanding his army in heaven as the Israelites were fighting on earth. But again, the host of heaven are not mentioned. Nor are the stars, just the sun and moon. Again, questionable, and yet you will find it in basically every dictionary entry trying to define the host of heaven. So those two, as military references, I'm not sure about. Then we come to Isaiah 13. Now, Isaiah 13 is the beginning. This is the beginning of the oracle against Babylon in Isaiah 13 and 14. And at first glance, it looks quite promising for the host of heaven. It says, I myself have commanded my consecrated ones, have summoned my warriors, my proudly exulting ones, whatever that means, to execute my anger. Listen, a tumult on the mountains as of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar of kingdoms gathering together. Yahweh of hosts is mustering an army for battle. Savah Milhamah. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens. Again, on first glance, that looks quite promising. An army for battle. Yet, the majority of scholars would say that this is not a reference to a divine army. Not least because a few verses later, we will get a reference to the Medes, the Persians who would come and conquer Babylon. And again, from that, a lot of people would date Isaiah 13 in the exilic period. Here, we also have an uproar of kingdoms gathering together, and people coming from distant places. We never see this with the host of heaven. They are just there. They never have to be gathered. They are always surrounding Yahweh. So some of the language doesn't really fit. And the most common interpretation of this passage, therefore, is of a human army, probably the Medes, acting on a cosmic scale to bring down Babylon, which in Isaiah 13 to 14, or at least 13, is the kind of epitome of evil and of cosmic rebellion against Yahweh. So those three, the big three, already not sure. Then Joshua 5. Joshua 5 refers to a very interesting individual called the commander of the host of Yahweh, Sa Tzva Adonai. And he appears to Joshua in kind of a bit of a fragment in Joshua 5. And it says, he appears, as commander of the host / army of Yahweh have now come, and Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped. And he said to him, what do you command your servant, my lord? And the commander, the Sa Tzva Adonai, said to Joshua, remove the sandals for your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. That line, removing sandals and feet, reminds us very much of Exodus with Moses, and it seems intended to cast Joshua in the mold of Moses. So we have this divine figure. He appears with a drawn sword, I should say, and he gives Joshua this message. And this figure, because of the word Sabah, commander of the army, he is often thought to be the commander of the heavenly armies, so the heavenly counterpart to Joshua. Joshua is the earthly commander of the Israelite army, and this guy is thought to be the heavenly commander, paralleling him. If that is true, however, his army is missing. This guy appears on his own. And again, the book of Joshua has no references to the host of heaven, apart from this Sabah. And actually no mention of Yahweh of hosts either, Adonai Sabaoth. Again, that language is missing. There's some interesting stuff going on with this passage, maybe, in that an appearance of a divine figure with a drawn sword was sometimes thought to be an omen of good luck, which we see in Mesopotamian texts. So this might be this figure appearing to Joshua to kind of be a good omen for the Battle of Jericho, which is about to happen next. Or it could be, as Martin Note argued, an etiology, perhaps sanctifying the area where Joshua was, which is around Bethel, apparently. However, this guy is suspiciously similar to the angel of Yahweh, these figures that we often get in the Pentateuch, but also elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, the Malach Adonai figures. The Malach Adonai figures almost always, that's not true, they do appear a couple of times in plural, but almost always they appear individually. They can quite often have drawn swords, which do not always signify military activity, and they bring a message. This figure seems to be very similar to the commander of the host of Yahweh in Joshua 5, who appears on his own with a drawn sword and carries a message, or delivers a message. Which raises a question then about whether the author was really trying to refer to this sort of figure, but has used host language because perhaps they're more comfortable with host language. And we should say at this point, although the primary meaning of tzavah is army, the second most common meaning is of a cultic congregation. And in Joshua 5-6, the context is both military but primarily cultic. In Joshua 5 we have Passover and circumcision. In Joshua 6 we have the conquest of Jericho, but it's a ritual conquest, it's not an actual battle when they're marching around. So it could be that our commander, or perhaps better leader maybe, of the host of Yahweh might be referring to the Israelites, the divine commander of the military cultic cohort of Israel in that passage. And I frankly think that makes more sense for Joshua 5. But I will grant, if there is one passage which you could argue the case for, it might be this one. But I'm not convinced about it. So those are the top references you'll find to support the idea that the host of heaven were Yahweh's army. I'll grant you Joshua 5 possibly, but the other three, I'm certainly not sure. And what we do find, if you turn to the next page, when we actually have Yahweh's army appearing in the Hebrew Bible, acting in a military manner, they are referred to with numerous other terms. Giborim, mighty ones or warriors, comes up quite a lot, especially in Joel. Chayilo, his strong ones, again in Joel. Machanehu, his army, again in Joel. There's a lot in Joel. Kodeshim, holy ones. That's interesting. In Deuteronomy 33 and Zechariah 14, the holy ones are not really described, but in Deuteronomy 33 they accompany Yahweh on his theophanic march. And in Zechariah 14, it's a prophecy of kind of the end times. On that day, Yahweh will come with his holy ones. And there's certainly a battle in Zechariah 14. So Kudoshim might be a term for army. We have numerous references to chariots. Chariots of fire, most famously, perhaps, in 2 Kings. Habakkuk 3 uniquely refers to individual deities that fight, or at least accompany Yahweh's chariots, Resheth and Deber. And then I've apparently missed off Joel, Job. Job 26 refers to Els Gudodave, which kind of means bands or troops. Basically, there is a whole variety of terms that are used to refer to Yahweh's army. Not one of them is tzavah. When you actually see the army accompanying Yahweh, fighting a battle, appearing in a military context, tzavah is just not there. Tzavah Hashemayim is not there. And Psalm 103 may actually, again, support that and argue against the association of tzavah with army. So Psalm 103 has, bless Yahweh his messengers, Malakev, that's that guy, in the plural. Bless Yahweh his messengers, mighty ones of power, Gibori Koach, who do his word. And that Gibori, the mighty ones, again that's the word for warriors, or mighty ones we see in Joel. So the messengers are described as mighty ones or warriors. The next line, bless Yahweh all his host, ministers, Mishratev, who do his will. That word for ministers occurs in numerous contexts. You could be a minister to a king, you could be a minister to a priest, you can minister to one another, but it's never military. So Psalm 103 might support the idea that there is actually a distinction between the host and military action. At the very least, I think what we can say from this variety of terms is that there is no fixed conception of Yahweh's army. The authors are using different terminology that either suited their context or that they were more familiar with, whatever it was, but they are not using tzavah. So if the host of heaven were Yahweh's army, they never act as an army in the biblical texts, which I think means that we have to re-examine why we think that they're an army. One of my thoughts along this matter is that the human army were always called tzavah, almost always, the human army of Israel and Judah, or armies, which is why people think that the host of heaven, tzavah Hashemayim, must be a divine army. Apart from perhaps in the mid-9th century under King Ahab, the armies of Israel and Judah were not great. They were comparatively small. Judah certainly seems to have problems with getting hold of iron for weapons at some point in the 6th century. They were regularly defeated, left, right and centre, by all the nations around them: Ammon, Moab, Philistia, Edom, and then of course the big ones, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. So maybe our authors did not want to call Yahweh's army a tzavah because of the earthly parallel, maybe. I do wonder if it's a theological distinction, because you don't want to run the risk of exactly portraying the human and divine armies the same way if your earthly armies weren't great. Possibly. I don't know. That is my thought. You can hopefully tell me what you think at the end. So, divine army, the most common, popular interpretation of them, I'm really not convinced. Luckily, the rest are a bit better. I say a bit better. The stars. The host of heaven as the stars. I've put the references on the handout for you again. The stars, or all the celestial bodies, perhaps. There are actually only 4 references which explicitly identify the host of heaven with the celestial bodies, which is quite interesting to note. And if anyone's interested in redaction, they are all quite redactionally suspicious. And then there are 3, 2 in 2nd Isaiah and 1 in Jeremiah 33, that seem to make an implicit connection between the host and the stars. But again, it's not as simple as saying the host of heaven are the stars. So we see in Deuteronomy 4:19, when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them, blah, blah, blah. There it seems that the host of heaven seem to be the sum total. The sun, the moon, the stars, all the host of heaven. They seem to be the whole, basically everything in the heavens is the host of heaven. So, everything. And it appears to be acknowledged that they are gods, things that Yahweh, your God, allotted to the peoples everywhere under heaven. So they seem to be divine, they seem to be all the celestial bodies, but Israel is not to worship them. That's really the key point. And we see that very similarly in Deuteronomy 17, a prohibition against serving other gods and worshipping them, whether the sun or the moon or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden. So again, we have the host of heaven paralleled with deities, other gods, the Elohim Acharim, which I'll come back to later. And again, they seem to be anything, just any celestial body. Jeremiah 8 is rather interesting. They will be spread, this is the bones of the worshippers. The bones of the worshippers will be spread before the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven, which they have loved and served, blah blah blah, bowed down to, inquired of, made offerings to. Here they seem to be perhaps just the stars. Not 100% clear, but perhaps the sun, the moon, and all the host of heaven. So perhaps they're the stars. But the interesting move that Jeremiah makes is that they seem to be inanimate. If they are divine in Jeremiah, they're not very powerful. They may not be thought to be divine. So it's just 3 verses stuck on the end of chapter 7. And it's basically saying that the punishment for astral worship will be that the bones will be cast out on the ground, covering the ground, beneath the sun, moon, and all the host of heaven. And it seems to be playing off the idea that, the gods, if they are gods, are not going to rescue their worshippers. So the worshippers given them a lifetime of service, but these inanimate entities are not going to return the favour and save them, cover up their bones, etc. And then we have 2 Kings 23, 23:5, which is a redactional nightmare. And it's completely unique in the books of Kings. But those who made offering to Baal, to the sun, the moon, the maybe constellations, Mazalot, and all the hosts of the heavens. That word constellations, Mazalot, is unique, it's a hapax, and it seems to be a corruption of the Akkadian term Mazarot. Mazarot meant stations, and it kind of seems to refer to positions, so positions of the stars or stations of the sun when it was moving through the sky. That's what it seems to refer to, but it literally means stations. So it's being used very, very oddly here. The author doesn't seem quite comfortable with what Mazarot was meant to be. So it could be that we have the sun, the moon, perhaps the constellations, and the host of heaven as the stars. Or it could be that host of heaven is an explanatory gloss trying to explain Mazalot. It's not quite clear. But essentially, so in the 4 most explicit references to the host of heaven being astral, it's not exactly clear quite what they are again. I think we can agree they are connected with the astral bodies in some sense, but whether that is just the stars, or whether it's the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets, constellations, everything else, we don't quite know. So that one is more complicated than it looks, but there is clearly an astral connection. Then we have the Divine Council. Again, a popular interpretation of the host of heaven, and one which we see very clearly in 1 Kings 22, and only in 1 Kings 22. We see numerous divine council scenes throughout the Hebrew Bible, but they're always using other terminology. Often the B'nai Elim or B'nai Elohim, or just various gods in the heavens. This is the only one that uses Savah HaShemayim, and it really is an interesting one. I love this passage. Then Micaiah says, "Therefore hear the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, with all the host of heaven standing beside him, to the right and to the left of him. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab, so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Then one said one thing, and another said another." That last bit, one said one thing, one said another. That's horrible in the Hebrew. It's just horrible. It's very, very awkward. But it's very cool, because as far as I know, and I'm happy to stand corrected, but as far as I know, this is the only example we have in the Hebrew Bible of divine beings other than Yahweh talking to each other and their speech being reported. We have other scenes where divine beings other than Yahweh speak, but they're normally speaking to Yahweh, or it's normally a one-to-one conversation. This is interesting because they're talking to each other and it's actually reported. That's kind of cool, even if we can't translate it very nicely. But this is a really theologically interesting passage. Yes, we have Yahweh sitting on his throne, great, and the host of heaven all around him, which is perhaps what we should think of when we think of the divine council scene. But Yahweh is plotting the death of his own king. Theologically quite important. And here the host of heaven seem to, firstly, obviously, signal Yahweh's kingship. He sits on the throne. He leads this divine council scene. He already has decreed Ahab's death. They just work out the plan to enact it. But there are also witnesses. They witnessed in the heavens that Yahweh said, basically, I want to kill Ahab. Which is important, because the death of an Israelite king was not going to look very good for Yahwism. The death of a king in battle didn't look great. Especially a very strong king, as Ahab was. So there are many questions about 1 Kings 22, whether or not it's historical, whether Ahab actually died in battle at remote Gilead. I have thoughts on that, but never mind. But the host of heaven in this passage are doing something important. This is not just an average divine council scene. They are playing a specific role, which I will come back to. Yeah, why not? So divine council, yes, but only one. And it's a weird one. And then, this is perhaps the clearest, the host of heaven as a divine congregation. So 2 Psalms, Psalm 103, Psalm 148, both probably dating quite late. Nehemiah 9:6, probably late. And then I've stuck on Daniel because I suppose I have to. I very much begrudged having to read about Antiochus IV for my PhD. Made me very angry. But I have to put it in because it does use the word host. But these are quite straightforward. Psalm 103, bless Yahweh, all his hosts, the ministers who do his will, we saw that before. Psalm 148:2, praise him, I've put angels, don't know why. Praise him, all his messengers, that is. Praise him, all his hosts. And then Nehemiah 9 is a really important one. Nehemiah 9 seems to be almost, as Manfred Oeming and Catherine Sams would have said, almost a creedal statement of Israel's identity. It kind of draws from all different important bits of the Pentateuch, important bits of Psalms, important bits of Israel's history, and seems to put them together in like one document. Which makes it really, really interesting that the host of heaven are mentioned in it. Because this is a very late text, Nehemiah 9, and it post-dates probably all the polemic against the host of heaven. So, apart from 1 Kings 22, probably should have said this earlier, the majority of references we get to the host is polemic against their worship. And then we seem to get these Psalms talking about the host praising Yahweh, and Nehemiah 9, where again, you are Yahweh, you alone, you've made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all thy host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them you give life, and the host of heaven worships you. So in a statement, perhaps, of Israel's identity, it's very important that the host of heaven are praising Yahweh. We know Yahweh, and we know who Yahweh is, and that he is deserving of worship, because, partly, the host of heaven worship him, which then provides a model for Israel to follow. And that bit in Nehemiah 9, it seems to be influenced by Genesis 1 to 2:4a, the creation stuff, but also the Psalms, because the host don't praise in Genesis. But it seems that this is quite an important element of the host. It's certainly consistent in these late texts, and I would argue that it stands in Daniel 8, though that's not normally how that passage is interpreted. But divine congregation, straightforward. And then mine, the one I would add to the dictionary entries, which no one yet has asked me to write, but I'll wait for it. One day we'll have a dictionary with the host of heaven in again. The undefined host. The vast majority of references to the host of heaven do not define them in any way. And by that I mean they don't identify them, but they also don't really give any indication. So they're not saying the hosts are worshipping. They're not saying that the hosts are kind of in the council. They just mention the host of heaven. And we have a chunk of these in 2 Kings, Parallels and Chronicles, Zephaniah 1, Jeremiah 19, Psalm 33, which could be the stars, but it doesn't say, and then Genesis 2:4. And I think these are interesting and important because people often try to explain these references via the others. So, for example, they will say that Zephaniah 1, 4-5, and Jeremiah 19, 13 must be references to astral worship because the people are bowing down to the host of heaven on rooftops. So the people bow down to the host of heaven on rooftops in Zephaniah, and in Jeremiah 19:13, they bow down and make offerings to the host of heaven, which is burnt offerings, on a rooftop. So many people say, well, it's on a rooftop, therefore it's obviously astral worship. Yes, logical, to a point. But we also know from antiquity that huge amounts of worship took place on rooftops, and it's not always astral. Could be, but doesn't have to be. The rooftop was a really important domestic space. It's interesting because it's partly public, partly private. But you could enact any cultic activity on a rooftop. So, I'm not saying that the astral interpretation on those is wrong, but it's also not necessitated just because we're on a rooftop. I had a huge footnote on that in my thesis. The ones in Kings are really, really interesting. They're so often just interpreted as astral worship because it's Manasseh, who was 7th century, and astral worship was really, really prominent in the 8th to 7th centuries. That's undeniable. So people have gone, oh, Manasseh's bowing down to the host of heaven, he's making altars for them, that must be astral worship. Again, logical to a point, but no evidence. It doesn't say anything about the sun, moon, and stars in these passages. And what's really interesting is that these ones in Kings might evoke connotations of a pantheon. Because they often, well, actually the ones I've put there, 2 Kings 17:16, 21:3, 23:4, are all occur in a triad, Baal, Asherah, and all the host of heaven. Which may evoke, and this is Tilda Binger, and John Day as well, but I agree with it. It might evoke connotations of the pantheon, because you've got a major male deity, a major female deity, and a plurality of lesser deities. And one of the ways you could refer to the Canaanite pantheon at Ugarit was El Athirat and the 70 sons of El. So when we see Baal, Asherah, and all the host of heaven, it evokes that kind of thing. So in this case, the host of heaven in Kings could be Manasseh bowed down to Baal, Asherah, and kind of everybody else. So if so, the reference may well, and is likely, broader than just astral worship. But that's interesting, whether that's, and it's only those ones in Kings that make that triad. Which is also interesting because it's clearly a polemical triad. Baal and Asherah were not consorts. But by putting 2 polemicized deities, or even 3, together, the polemic against all of them contributes to that sort of triad being a problem. But then, so if this, so what then are the hosts of heaven? Not the army. That's the only thing I'm clear on. But even if we say, well, they were the divine congregation, well, what does that mean? Is that just Levantine deities? Just Yahwistic deities? Did it include Mesopotamian deities? Egyptian? Were goddesses included? We don't know. And perhaps, I wonder if we are thinking, at least in Kings, about a pantheon, maybe we see them acting in so many different ways because you could enact any roles in a collective. If you've got some more militaristic deities in there, then perhaps, oh no, I'm arguing against myself. Ignore that one. If you had some divine council people in there, then perhaps it points to the divine council. Let's just move on. Pretend I didn't have them. But in all these passages, essentially, we know very little about the hosts of heaven themselves, but often we know more about the other things going on in these passages. So they seem to function almost as divine markers of identity. If you worship the host, you are sinful, but you know Yahweh is the high God because they worship or they serve him. So in the divine council, they point to Yahweh's kingship. When they're being worshipped by Israel on earth, they point to human sin. So perhaps we're not supposed to know exactly what they were. Maybe it's more about what they're doing in the passage than their specific identity. And again, I think this is something that I'm wondering about, whether this lack of naming is polemical. Because in antiquity, the gods had names. And they had their own iconographic traditions. They had their own temples. We've got Baal up there, looking a little bit fuzzy. But Baal, in his, that's a late bronze figurine, in his striking or smiting pose. The famous Tanakh cult stand, which has been argued quite widely to have Asherah on the bottom and the third layer, and Yahweh here 2 cherubim flanking an empty space, and perhaps here as well, with a quadruped and a winged sun disk. This is thought and argued to be representative of Yahweh and Asherah. This is Asherah for sure, the stylized tree with 2 caprids. Sin of Haran, Aramean, and wider, but this is an Aramean depiction of the moon god, the crescent moon. And Shamash, of course, Assyrian sun god Shamash. But this is the point. Gods have names. You can't. they have their own traditions. They have their own characteristics. Baal, we know, is a storm god. He was a warrior, but that's also slightly connected with fertility. Asherah, clearly fertility. Shamash, the sun god, which would later become representative of the empire. But I wonder then if the host of heaven are to some extent perhaps polemical. Perhaps because they do not have a name, they do not have an identity, and essentially because they're such a generic term, you can lump everybody into that term. Anything and everything, whatever the author wants, can be covered by the term host of heaven. And if you think about the fact that in the late texts, the host of heaven are worshipping Yahweh, if we think that this could be other deities within the host of heaven, bowing down and worshipping Yahweh, that could perhaps be a polemical move. And we do see this happening with other deities. So the other gods I mentioned earlier, the Elohim Acharim, clearly refers to gods other than Yahweh, and they're always bad. And again, conflated. What is Elohim Acharim? Could be the major Mesopotamian deities, could just be local things. We also see the Baalim. So Baal we know, is that guy. But we see references to Baalim, generic plural terms for other deities that are polemicized against. On the female side, we have Ashtaroth. Again, Asherah we know. Ashtaroth is just a generic collection of goddesses that we don't want. So I wonder then, maybe, not in every reference, I don't think all the host of heaven references are polemical. I think there was probably a host of heaven idea that we maybe see in 1 Kings 22. But the term has polemical potential, perhaps, because it's so vague, because it's never defined anywhere. That gives our authors a lot of freedom. So perhaps their name is polemical? Oh yes, so I hate that picture. But I hate it. But the hosts of heaven, because they don't have a name, they just become a faceless, nameless mass. Anything and everything is there. If you had major deities in there with their own traditions, now they're just collapsed into a generic host of heaven, who, without their traditions and identities being reported, and their worship being forbidden, could quite easily pass out of cultural memory, which they did. So that was that. But the main way in which they're polemicized against is by their rituals. So interestingly, apart from perhaps Jeremiah 8, and there are 2 references, maybe 2 in Isaiah, the host of heaven are not directly polemicized against. The biblical texts do not say the host of heaven are not gods. They don't say, they're not powerful, they're not relevant. What they say is don't worship them. Do not bow down to them, do not make offerings to them, do not follow them, inquire of them, which seems to be more a concern about controlling ritual. And this is actually what my PhD was on. Which is interesting, because normally the texts where they're polemicized against are the Deuteronomistic ones, which you might have seen by now. Deuteronomy, Kings, Jeremiah, maybe Zephaniah. And we never talk about ritual in these texts. We talk about monotheism, the development of cult, but actually these are polemics against rituals and ritual practice. So the host of heaven themselves are not necessarily explicitly polemicized against. Rather, the people are polemicized against. Which permits the host of heaven to retain their existence, to retain a presence, as long as you don't worship them. We can still have them. And that leads us on to the end. I didn't want to go on too much about ritual, but very happy to take questions on literally my entire PhD. in that one slide. This is annoying, this is actually cut off the final line, which is all the heavenly host worship you, but there we are. Technology. But I wonder, then, if the hosts of heaven in the later texts are perhaps a compromise to some extent. They exist. They are deities. We're not denying their existence. We're not quite in that monotheistic, much later idea. But they worship God. And in that sense, they provide a model for Israel to follow, which they weren't doing previously. Previously, they appeared to be gods, and Israel then worshipped them. Now, they worship Yahweh, and in so doing, Israel seeing that, reading about it, reported in the texts, Israel should worship Yahweh as well. Because why would you worship the lesser deities who are worshipping the big one? Worship the big one. And if so, if this is kind of a compromise, then it raises interesting questions, because it may be, we think about Baal and Asherah. They were polemicized against, they were worshipped, definitely, as part of Israel's history. Then they were polemicized against and kind of disappear from the biblical text and disappear from Israelite traditions. Or maybe they get subsumed into the host of heaven. If you have this term, host of heaven, which refers to potentially everything in heaven, especially when it's all the host of heaven, Kol Tzavah HaShemayim, perhaps they just get subsumed. So they are still there, they still are present, existing, but now they worship Yahweh, rather than being worshipped themselves. Which I think makes, perhaps, a logical trajectory. Rather than just suddenly Israel stops worshipping these things, and it's deemed that they're completely irrelevant and just don't even bother. Well, maybe actually this is how they become part of Yahwistic tradition. Maybe they get assimilated. If so, of course, that raises quite interesting questions for modern monotheistic traditions, which still retain belief in angels. So the host of heaven are unique in the Hebrew Bible because they are the subject of polemic, and whereas everything else disappears, they remain. They're kind of reformed. And perhaps they're also unique in that they have actually survived in the form of angels down to this time. So yeah, perhaps who are these figures? We don't know, but I think, and I hope I've convinced you that they are more interesting and far more complicated than we first think. So, thank you.